Dr. J. Gilbert is our speaker for this evening, and Jay is has a long-standing collector of ghost stories and stories of the supernatural. In To begin with, in her local area, in which is she originates from northeast of England, and that's passion has stayed with her as far as we have the positive proof of that because she's just written a book. Um, and she has developed that into a serious form of sort of a research project, which has now become the book Haunted, which hopefully you will have picked up on when you saw the advert for this particular event. And Haunted goes into those ghost stories. And sees how they have arisen, how they become embedded, how they become repeated, how they become part of the sort of cultural fabric of particular localities. Jay herself has her doctorate from the University of Leicester, and she is at present a lecturer at the Open University. But this is, I get the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, I get the impression that this is kind of your real passion, and hopefully we will hear more about both the book and the numerous stories that have come out of your researches over the next 45 minutes or so. Okay, Jay, are you here and ready to go?
Okay, so shall I take it away?
Yeah, fire away, fire away. I'll shut up and I'll let you entertain the troops.
Okay, so I am going to share my extremely creepy presentation. Okay, so yeah, as you said, this is kind of has been a passion project for me. It's not at all what I was trained for. I mean, there are elements of it. The first people have asked me, did I have I written another book when they've read this one? And I've had to say yes, but you won't like it. It's a monograph called Dialects of Early Medieval Northumbrian, and that is essentially what my doctorate was in. But the ghost stories thing and the connection between ghost stories and community has always really fascinated me. And particularly in this talk, what I want to focus on is some of the histories of what horrors we've seen in the underground. So this is things that we've seen over time, which we might have changed our opinion about things, but also how our geography is connected really strongly with what we believe. And I remember I read fairly recently in National Geographic an article about how places in South America that are along the sort of seismic lines of volcanoes, how the belief systems of these people were all based around kind of the life cycle of the volcano, that the understanding that your life is lived in the shadow of this sort of massive thing which comes underground and overground, and it really shaped the way that they saw the world. Um, and in my I found that there's a lot of that visible as well in places in the United Kingdom, particularly where the underground has featured significantly in people's lives. So be that because of mining, um, because of underground metro systems, things like that. We perceive the underground in a way that is quite dependent on cultural context. So at the start of October last year, I did a little book tour for my book, and the first place that I went, weirdly, was Bodmin Jail in Cornwall. So I don't know if you're familiar with it at all. It's famous because it was the first reform prison. So there's a big attraction. You can see the hanging pit when you check in. Someone says, "Enjoy your sentence" when they check you into your room, and it's pretty creepy. In fact, I actually, in the middle of the night, became convinced that someone was in my room and had to put the light on and slept with the light on. And then the next morning, I spoke to somebody else who'd been speaking at the event, and she said that not only did she have the light on, she had the television on all night. So I felt a bit better then, because she also works on paranormal stuff. But so yeah, I wouldn't recommend it if you wanted to go for a restful stay. But if you wanted to go somewhere creepy and really kind of absorb the vibes. Do think about it. But I was there giving a talk about my book as part of an event which rejoiced in the name of the Dark Symposium. And like with most symposiums, I was kind of expecting to be led into a seminar room, but instead, we actually did the event underground. So when you go into the attraction part of the jail, what was the jail is the hotel. I have to be clear, I was sleeping in a cell. It's a very posh cell, but it was a cell. Whereas the actual attraction, you go down into this cavern. It's really kind of slick. There's a bookcase which opens up, and then you can go down into this cavern. And I got to stand at a podium with dry ice swirling around it. So, you feel like Prince. It's great. But the point is, being underground makes things inherently creepier. So whoever decided that they were going to put this talk underground had the right idea. It's not that underground is a liminal space as such. It's kind of a forbidden one. So when we're underground, it feels like we're in a place that's not meant for us. And I think that's especially true when you've spent many, many months, as I had, researching the folklore and ghost stories of the British Isles. Because the underground figures a lot. And so what I'm going to discuss this evening is, what do we think lives underground? And how does this change according to time and place? And what do we think we're actually afraid of? And so one of the chapters in my book is about witches, which might not sound as if it's relevant here, but I'm going to explain why it is. So there's a witches' circle in Grimsbury. I don't know if you know what a witches' circle is. It can be kind of a cluster of trees or a cluster of plants that seem to grow up in a circle. In this case, it's a cluster of trees. And this witches' circle has historically also been called a fairy ring, which on kind of a superficial level, you might think, if you were not particularly invested in folklore, that this means perceptions really shifted. This place was really nice and now it's really creepy. But actually, the line between fairies and witches historically has been very blurred. So, for example, iron has been posited as a metal that could defend against both. And some witches were said to derive their powers from their interaction with fairies. And in previous centuries, the image that we now might have of little delicate winged creatures who flutter around like Tinkerbell did not jive at all with what people expected a fairy to be. They felt that fairies could be very bad news. So one major distinction between witches and fairies that I discovered in my research is that witches don't live underground. A lot of really early material about witches and fairies talks about the Middle Earth, the Midgard, which is from where Tolkien got the idea of Middle Earth. It's the place between our world and the other side, and it's not for witches. So a witch can be incredibly sinister, but even she can't get near the potential for sinisterness of the things that live in the middle, in the underworld. Particularly in northern England, where I'm from, and in Scotland, the underground was the realm of the fairies until relatively recently. Just before we started talking in this meeting, Stu and I were discussing some sort of 70s ballad groups like Steel Eye Span and Fairport Convention, who talked about Thomas the Rhymer and, as you see here, Tam Lin. So Thomas the Rhymer was spirited away by the Queen of Elfhame. When he comes back, he can't tell a lie, it's impossible. Elfhame is just Scots for elf home, basically. But the interesting thing is how often this figure was invoked in Scottish witch trials in the 16th century. One woman, Bessie Dunlop, confessed that she'd had congress with one of the good neighbours or brownies who dwelt at the court of Fairy, and they'd come to take her away. But she's very keen to tell the court that she refused. She did not want to go to the court of Fairy, so that's all right. Meanwhile, Andrew Mann said that he'd seen the devil his master in the company of the Queen of Elfhame. And there are other examples, but essentially this figure crops up quite a lot during this period of the Scottish witch trials, as if she is influential on the witches. She's in congress with the witches. And on the slide, you'll see a quote from the Ballad of Tam Lin. The Queen of Elfhame is pretty sinister there. So she lives, in Yon Green Hill. She basically captures men and she entertains them in her subterranean house for 7 years. But then she has to pay a tiend or a tithe to hell. And essentially, the man that she's stolen is given away as a tithe to the devil. So this is all obviously connected to Irish folklore, according to which the original inhabitants of Ireland were driven underground by this warrior tribe who invaded. And some believe that the fairies are fallen angels who repented before reaching hell. Um, but by and large, this understanding of the underground as a place where fairies lived, and fairies being a people that you really shouldn't cross, has underlain a lot of understanding of the world in the British Isles in particular for centuries and centuries. Oh, sorry. So the question is then, what have we replaced fairies with? I think it's fairly safe to say that the idea of fairies and the history of fairy belief underlies a lot of the things that we believe in now. But most people are not going to be frightened of fairies. Even children who are frightened of ghosts and ghouls and the Babadook are not going to be frightened of fairies. But we have had lots and lots of other things to replace them with. So miners, if you've ever met a miner, I grew up in a place where lots and lots of the people's granddads around me were retired miners. You will know that they are a pretty superstitious lot, and they do have good reason to be. For hundreds of years, there were big tranches of northern England, Cornwall, and Wales, particularly, that were identified by their mining culture. And a lot of these places are now oddly defined by the loss of it. They're post industrial. We've all heard the phrase former mining towns. And in some ways, this is a bit strange. The last mines in Britain closed with very few exceptions in the 80s. The only miners still living in these areas are long retired. And yet, in other ways, there's a lot of sense behind the continued association. Mining might have ended, but the presence of the mines themselves has not. And in the place where I grew up, the village that I grew up in, there was an enormous mine that steamed away until the early 80s and then was replaced with a country park. And the country park is now so kind of vast and green and always populated by tourists that you would not know that the mine had been there if you didn't know that it had been there. Except that everywhere you go in this country park, you can see evidence of it in the way that the ground is sunk, in the way that there's little signposts and memorials. And sometimes we find evidence of this mountain past in language. So, for example, in County Durham, there's a really famous dialect called Pitmatic, which is miners' talk, essentially. And if you've ever been to the Northeast and you're not from there, or even if you are from there, you'll probably have heard it's a very distinct tongue or a variety of tongues around the Northeast, and sometimes difficult to understand. And when you lay a Pitmatic on top of that, it only makes it more so. But the ongoing influence of the mining history of places sometimes is geographical. So we might have had to build or rebuild places to accommodate bits where a pit once fell in. My great grandmother was buried in a cemetery that then pretty much the entire cemetery fell into the pit. So they moved the cemetery. You know, stuff like that is kind of pragmatic responses to mining. But also sometimes superstitions allow us to continue to feel the presence of mining. And we know that all of the living miners might have abandoned their tasks underground, but some people think that there are strange underground companions who haven't yet come to the surface and joined the modern world. And perhaps they've never actually left the mines. There's lots of different names that have been given to these supernatural beings in the mines. Common one is blue cap. A blue cap is a thing more like a fairy than a goblin. It has a glowing blue flame and it guides respectful workers to deposits of ore or away from potential cave-ins. I'm sure you can imagine what happens to workers who are not respectful. It's always the same thing with these fairy beings. And similar creatures elsewhere might have different names, but they all perform similar functions. On a good day, the being might direct miners to a good seam. It might help the miner to work the seam. They have a telltale glow, which could indicate the presence of good fortune or it could be a warning to get out. And of course, it's interesting that these beings are associated with a blue glow or a green glow because fairies always were too. And of course, in the underground world, there are lots of gases and interactions which could cause that. So we're seeing the same thing, but we are connecting it to a different superstitious cause. Interestingly, another one of the pseudonyms for blue cap is kobold or cobbler now. And these words are both directly related to the English goblin, but the German kobold actually gave its name to the mineral cobalt because there was a medieval belief that it was responsible for the poisonous qualities of the ores, such as cobaltite and smeltite, that were being mined. So they actually thought the blue glowing creature was what gave cobalt its poisonous qualities, but also if you can cast your mind back to GCSE chemistry, if you light a bit of cobalt, it will produce this stunning blue flame. Now, this sort of creature is now best known by its Cornish name. And this is not just because Cornwall was so replete with miners, but also because so many of the Cornish miners actually made the journey across the Atlantic to the United States, and they took their folklore with them. So Cornish words made their way into the local language and almost incidentally into literature. Cornish miners called these creatures knockers, and when they got to Pennsylvania, their Pennsylvanian descendants added the prefix Tommy. You might have heard of Tommy knockers because of Stephen King's book, which was the third best-selling book of the 1980s, in fact. And his interpretation of the creature is not really bearing a strong resemblance to that which the Cornish miners would have understood. It's quite Lovecraftian. But it's really easy to remember his rhyme. Late last night and the night before, Tommy knockers, knocking on the door. It is just a little snapshot in popular culture. And it means that the idea of these beings as Tommy knockers has kind of clung on for a bit. But they're all the same thing. So this is quite an interesting story. When Cornish miners started locating to California in the first half of the 19th century, it was because the Americans wanted their particular expertise. So the skills involved in mining tin at that point were pretty much uniquely found in Cornwall. And these skills are very readily transferable to gold mining. So the people who moved from Cornwall to the United States to do mining were called cousin jacks. And many of these cousin jacks would have had their boat fare paid by a 49er, a gold miner, who was really keen to bolster the knowledge and experience of his existing team. However, I think the Americans didn't anticipate that they would not just be getting pragmatic skills from Cornwall. These miners knew how to wield a pick, they knew how to tap a vein, they knew how important it was to communicate and prepare and anticipate to make sure that everyone who got into a pit would then make it out again. But they also thought that there were more things in the mines than were dreamt of in the Americans' philosophy. So they had a saying, according to these Cornish miners, a pit without knockers is a pit without fortune. And they wouldn't be budged on this point. So eventually the Americans conceded it. If the cousin jacks will not enter the mine without being assured that there are knockers inside it, protecting the workers from harm, then we just got to accept that there are knockers in the mine. Those who believed in the knockers paid attention to the creaks and the rappings that they made, which could signify imminent danger of collapse. And the Cornish said that if you didn't listen to the warnings, you could expect a pretty speedy demise. So at the very beginning of the introduction of Cornish miners into Pennsylvania, the Californians took some convincing, but by the time the mining industry of El Dorado County in California came to an end in 1956, the miners were pretty well trained in the need to respect their mysterious colleagues. The manager of one of the oldest and largest mines in the area was petitioned to formally release the mine's Tommyknockers from employment so that they could find work elsewhere within the Californian mining system. I love this. More than one mine had been abandoned because repeated knockings and collapses would have led the workers to think the knockers there had been angered. And so what they didn't want to do was make the workers even angrier by closing them up in a pit and leaving them unemployed. And thinking about it scientifically, of course, you can argue that the signatures of the knockers, things like taps and creaks, which preceded disaster, eerie blue or green glow in the darkness, would have been caused by gas and natural subsidence, which is what happens when you mess about underground, right? Um, but the manager didn't really want to take that chance. He'd been so long exposed to this idea of how important knockers were to a mine and the reality of them that he did actually formally release the Tommy knockers. And so the miners were able to go on with their lives without worrying about having crossed them. In the UK, the same thing wasn't necessarily true. So interestingly, the Cornish have taken their folklore across the ocean. It's continued on, it's changed slightly, and it's been respected. But back in the UK, there were still kind of tin, coal, copper mines limping on through the end of the 20th century. And the knocker legend was not perhaps as clear, as distinct in this country as it was in the United States. So in some areas, people forgot about the knockers and what they were. But of course, the elements which signified their presence still went on. So when I was reading this book, I really wanted to gather quite a lot of as many miners' stories as I possibly could, just to get a sense of what miners believed. And I found this guy called Brian Long, who is an independent author who used to be a miner, and he has put together two collections of miners' tales. Most of them, from what I can tell, he got from either himself and his friends, or from forums and private online groups. And the books are called Tales from the Deep and Presence in the Pit. They're both pretty interesting. They're just kind of big pamphlets. You can get them on eBay. But Brian, he has spent most of his career in the mines until I think he worked in a mine under the North Sea until about 2002. And he says, some say that a spirit never leaves the pit, carrying on with the job they left behind. Some say they come back to check on their friends. What we nearly all agree is that mines are an eerie place to work. And of course, it's not hard to understand why. I once went in the course of researching this book to Blaenau Festiniog. Apologies to any Welsh people if I've butchered that pronunciation, but there is a really, really creepy tin mine there that you can go into. Um, and when you go down, we went down with a single mine worker. Of course, it's an attraction now, but there was nobody else there. So it was me, my partner, and this mine worker. And we go down in this cage exactly the way you would have gone down to work in the mine. And then once we were in there, she turned all the lights off. And it's so just the size of the darkness is so horrific. And I'm thinking, my ancestors were miners for generations. We've got a big family photograph which has little crosses on it on the people who were killed in the mining collapse. Because this idea of going underground and never coming back is really embedded in certain communities. So it's not surprising that the people who live and work in these areas feel the need to put something there to make themselves feel safer. And one man who I was talking to when I was researching this book told me a story about a strange light which drifted towards him in the mine and then vanished. And a lot of other miners in Brian Long's book, and also in the people from the people that I spoke to in various social clubs in the Northeast, talked about ghostly ex-colleagues who were still seen doing their jobs. For example, multiple miners mentioned a strange additional miner who would always be there in the cage that was transporting them back to the surface after their shift. Almost as if some people just can't clock off, however hard they try. They don't want to be left behind. So as we can see then, folklore shifts. The original mine dwellers of the British Isles, the knockers and the blue caps and the cob now were fairy kin, inhabitants of the ancestral underground realm of the fair folk. But in the United States, they are removed from this context. And they're therefore, if you read knocker lore from the 21st and 20th centuries in Pennsylvania, it seems that they usually imagine the knockers to be sort of once human. So they think of them as being the ghosts of dead miners who are still protecting their descendants. And in the UK in the 20th century, by which point the idea of what a fairy was had shifted. knockers are conceived of again as being much more like spirits. So we get the same experiences and interactions which keep popping up, but they're interpreted according to the cultural context of the experiencer. If we think back to what Thomas the Rhymer experienced, where he disappeared for some years and then came back and he couldn't tell a lie, now that seems more in line with what we might think of as an extraterrestrial abduction or something like that, rather than anything to do with fairies. So we're framing the things that we experience or think we experience in a different way, but the effect of them is ultimately the same. Okay, so we've accepted them. We don't default to fairies anymore when we're thinking about what lives underground. But it still seems very much that as long as there is an underground world, we really want to picture something being in it, which seems counterproductive. But in some communities, such as the Navajo and the Pueblo tribes in the southwestern United States, they think the earth is a womb from which all life sprang. So they really want to return to it because it's a place of fertility, fecundity, rebirth. But in much of the West, if we think about going below the surface of the earth, you feel this sense that you are culturally alienating yourself from God. So it logically follows that if you go closer and closer to where we imagine the devil to be, you shouldn't be that surprised if you come face to face with some of his associates. And this was certainly much more of a concern in the 19th century when construction began on the London Underground. So in the 1860s, quite a lot of alarm bells were rung with people who thought that there couldn't be any good that would come from going down into the bowels of the earth. And they weren't thinking about things like, oh my goodness, we're going to tunnel through a plague pit. You know, they weren't thinking in pragmatic terms. There's this fantastic quotation from the Reverend Dr. John Cumming, who said that the forthcoming end of the world will be hastened by the construction of the railways, burrowing into infernal regions and thereby disturbing the devil. But nobody listened to the Reverend Dr. John Cumming, and the Metropolitan Railway, which was actually the first underground rail network in the world, was opened in 1863. And since then, the tube network has been expanded endlessly. It covers 250 miles of track across the Greater London area. And as I say, it's gone through plague pits, monasteries, Roman ruins. Nobody was worried about that, but they were definitely worried about being too close to the devil. Although, you know, these days, not so much. There are about 5 million people who use the network every single day, and most of them are probably not thinking very much about what is outside of the tube carriage, what is in the tunnel, apart from themselves. But for some people, the underground network does feel like a completely different world. Every night when the trains have stopped, did you know that the tracks are checked manually by underground workers who walk them in the dark? They have a cap light, and that's it. So in a modern network like the Underground, obviously we're not still hearing people talking about blue caps and cobbler now and fairies, but it seems that a lot of people who work on the tube certainly feel that they're not there all alone, suggesting that maybe the Reverend Cummings' concerns were not completely without foundation. In the course of my research for my book, I spoke to a man called Alan in Kennington Station. And I did this because I had watched a 2005 documentary called Ghosts on the Underground. This was directed by Joe Kane, and you can find it online. He said that in this documentary, there are dozens and dozens of workers sharing their tales of lights in the tunnels, figures visible on CCTV cameras, but not to the naked eye, and sort of echoing noises of places where there'd been a stampede or a bombing in the past. But also specifically, it includes two different accounts of the so-called Kennington Loop horror. This is one of the most notorious Tubeland hauntings. And so that was why I thought, well, I'll go to Kennington Station and I'll speak to a guard and I'll see if he's heard of the Kennington Loop haunting. And this lovely chap, Alan, said to me that, yeah, there are hardly any underground staff who don't have at least one unsettling story to tell. And I asked him, has he heard the story of the Kennington Loop? Has it ever happened to him? So I'd like to read you my slightly stylized version of what he told me. So Kennington Tube Station was for many years the final destination of most southbound trains on the snarled tripartite Northern Line. The line's two northerly branches come together here before diverging again, like the proverbial two roads in a wood. And while some trains carry on south towards Morden, many used to turn around at Kennington and retrace their tracks in the opposite direction. In 2021, a long-awaited extension to the Northern Line opened. Now the majority of trains that would once have terminated at Kennington will continue instead through Nine Elms, carrying hip, sleek apartment dwellers to their hip, sleek apartments, never flats, in the vast Art Deco building that was in a former life Battersea Power Station. Few southbound trains today make the lonely trek around the subterranean circle of track known as the Kennington Loop. Train drivers like Alan greeted the news of the Battersea Line extension with great cheer, not because they felt London needed more innovative mixed-use neighbourhoods, but because to Alan's mind every minute spent in the Kennington Loop is a minute too many. For tube enthusiasts, and there are many, many tube enthusiasts, the Loop has something of a cult appeal. Perhaps it's the allure of the forbidden, of evading the TfL workers whose job it is to usher passengers off the train before it conducts its U-turn to arrive back at Kennington again, now pointing in the opposite direction. There's also a particular uniqueness about this, the only place in Tubeland where, should you miss your stop, there's a second chance to catch it. Travelling the Loop deliberately, though, as part of a determined group, is an entirely different thing to travelling it alone. Despite the best efforts of train evacuators at Kennington, it's certainly possible to do this unintentionally. My friend Tish, an avid podcast devourer and regular Northern Line user, reports having been jolted back to reality on a number of occasions, only to discover she had accidentally travelled beyond the end of the line, into the liminal space of the Loop. She reported no hauntings, but then she was never really alone on the train. None of us civilians will ever know the reality of being, entirely and completely, alone in the Loop. Alan knows. Alan has been driving tube trains for 27 years. He is the disembodied voice pleading with tourists to move down inside the carriage or berating the backpacker whose designer rucksack is preventing the door from closing. On the Northern Line, which remains non-automated, it is Alan who closes the carriage doors, and it is Alan who, when the train has been emptied at Kennington, pilots it into the darkness of the Loop, where it is held, sometimes for 15 minutes at a time. In Kennington Loop, as the sole occupant of a train empty of all but its ghosts, 15 minutes can seem very long indeed. As a young train operator, Alan was quick to dismiss the stories others told of the long-dead track walkers with their gas lanterns, eternally walking their routes, of the screams heard at Bethnal Green where, in 1943, 173 people were crushed to death during an air raid. Alan is a Londoner, as familiar with the tube as with his own front street. The Underground, he thought, was not haunted. The notion was ridiculous. By the time Alan had worked on the network for a year, he told me, he knew how wrong he'd been. What knowledge ordinary Londoners have of the tube network is superficial, contained to station platforms and within carriage walls. The underground world of train operators is another thing altogether, a labyrinth beneath London known to nobody but those whose job it is to keep it running. Like miners, underground workers are a community of their own, leaving their homes daily to descend into the bowels of the earth. Like miners, they are suspicious and superstitious. After all, people are killed on the underground with horrifying regularity, and Alan believes there are many souls who enter the tube network but never leave. At least one of them is trapped in the Kennington Loop. Anyone who has ever heard the internal doors on a tube train being opened and shut will know that the sound it makes is like no other. It's a distinctive ka-clunk, ka-clunk, different from the whoosh of the external doors sliding into place. Nobody should be opening and closing internal doors on a tube train without good reason. They certainly shouldn't be doing it on an empty train, held surrounded in the darkness beyond Kennington, with nobody but Alan to hear the sound. One evening in the late 1990s, Alan sat alone in the cab of a Northern Line train, awaiting the signal to move. The train had been emptied at Kennington. There were no sleepy drunks, disoriented in the rear carriage, no late night commuters too engrossed in their papers to have realised the train had terminated. There was no conductor. Definitively, unavoidably, Alan was alone. In the silent embrace of the tunnel, the ka-clunk sound was as startling as a gunshot. Alan jerked upright in his seat. He was alone, he repeated mentally to himself, entirely alone. There was no possibility that anyone could have opened and closed a carriage door. Alan thought frantically, attempting to calm his racing heart. Noises carry strangely underground. Could it be that the sound had come from another train further up the track? Seemed unlikely, but then any other suggestion seemed impossible. Alan struggled to engage his brain. He clenched his fists in his lap and tried to breathe. The train had been cleared at Kennington, but it was always possible that a mistake had been made, particularly if someone specifically did not want to be seen. This was a calming thought for 5 seconds before alarm bells rang again, thoughts of maniacs and assassins cannoning through Alan's head. What if... Ka-clunk. That was the next carriage. The period of time between the sounds seemed to have decreased. Alan glanced frantically between the cameras on his dashboard, looking for a stowaway, but there was nothing. Nobody. He was alone on the train. Ka-clunk. The sound was close behind him now, the doors to the front carriage opening and closing. Alan was paralysed. He closed his eyes. Perhaps this was it, his final moment. Any second now, whoever was travelling with him would burst into the operator's cab, and then... The signal buzzed. Time to move. Alan exhaled, then inhaled near desperately, his hands shaking as he engaged the controls. Back to Kennington and into the light. The brightness of the platform felt like benediction. On the platform, a station worker hastened to prop him up, then said, Alan will never forget it, internal doors. Between them, they searched the train again. It was empty. Alan had, as he thought, been alone. The station worker said he'd heard the story of the doors 1,000 times from train operators, and they'd all worn the same expression upon emerging from the loop that he'd seen on Alan's face. Someone had told him a passenger had been killed once, trying to board a train between the carriages. It might have been true. So, humans are afraid of the dark. And I think it seems to be a fairly instinctive fear. And over the millions and millions of years of our existence, it's this fear that's made us see, perceive, implant figures in the dark places underground. Maybe we simply can't conceive of there being a subterranean land with nobody in it. Maybe it's actually more frightening if it's empty. But clearly, what we imagine to be underground is shaped by our cultural perceptions. So as a train driver, Alan's privy to the law of tube workers. Ergo, if you imagine Kennington Loop to be haunted, you're more likely to witness a haunting in the Kennington Loop. And many late to the game 20th century miners didn't have any knowledge of earlier knocker law. So when they saw the same green glows and heard the same noises as their predecessors, they interpreted them as ghosts. Because in the modern world, it's somehow easier to believe in ghosts than in fairies. But the thing is that everyone is seeing and hearing the same thing. As I mentioned at the start, until the mid-19th century, we were still pretty frightened of the fair folk, and many people still believed they lived under our hills. Things like horseshoes above the doors of old cottages. They're there. There's this vague idea, well, it's iron, it's probably there to ward off witches, but just as likely it's there to stop the fairies from crossing you. And once inextricably intertwined with this belief in witches, the concept of fairies has sort of faded away, but we still needed something to replace it. It's as if for as long as we've still got these caves and these mines and hollows underground, we have a kind of need to put something in them. The underworld has a reputation that precedes it. It unnerves us. And so we populate it with beings who, depending on our context, may be post-human, subhuman, or non-human. Because if they're not in there, what is? Okay. So on that positive note, I'm going to stop talking now unless anybody has any questions. And here's a little plug for my book in case you wanted to know what it was and where to get it.